Cowboy took 3 arrows to save a Apache girl. Next day, she asked to be his wife, the blood pooling beneath. Ezra Whitman's chest told him everything he needed to know about dying. 3 Apache arrows had found their mark, each one a burning reminder that some choices cost more than a man bargains for. But as he watched the young woman he'd just saved disappear into the canyon shadows, her dark eyes holding his for one last moment, he knew he'd make the same choice again. 24 hours earlier, none of this seemed possible. The New Mexico territory stretched endlessly under a merciless August sun, its red earth cracked like broken pottery. Ezra guided his buckskin mare through the narrow pass between towering sandstone cliffs, the silence so complete it pressed against his eardrums. He'd been tracking stolen cattle for 3 weeks, following a trail that led deeper into Apache country with each passing day. Most men would have turned back by now. Most men weren't carrying the weight Ezra carried. The ranch he'd worked for 7 years was gone, burned. The family who'd taken him in after his parents died in a Comanche raid had been murdered in their sleep by rustlers who wanted more than just cattle. Ezra had been in town that night, drinking away memories that refused to stay buried. When he'd returned at dawn to find the bodies, something inside him had broken clean through. Now he rode alone, following thieves who'd stolen more than livestock. They'd stolen his purpose, his belonging, his carefully constructed peace. The badges and rewards meant nothing. This was about settling a debt written in blood and ash. The mare's ears suddenly pricked forward, swiveling toward a sound Ezra's human hearing couldn't detect. He reined her to a stop, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. In Apache territory, every shadow could hide death. Every silence could precede screaming. That's when he heard it. Faint at first, like wind through canyon walls, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, speaking in rapid Apache, followed by harsh male laughter that made his jaw clench. The sound was coming from beyond the next ridge, maybe 200 yards ahead. Ezra dismounted and ground-tied his mare, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. The weapon was a Henry repeater, worn smooth by countless hands, but deadly accurate in the right ones. He'd learned to shoot from his father, a former cavalry officer who taught him that sometimes survival meant making hard choices quickly. Moving on foot, he worked his way up the rocky slope, using scrub oak and scattered boulders for cover. The voices grew clearer as he climbed, and what he heard made his blood turn cold. 3 men speaking English with harsh accents, their words crude and threatening. And a woman responding in Apache, her voice steady despite circumstances that would terrify most people. When Ezra reached the ridge and peered over, what he saw below made his finger tighten on the trigger. 3 white men had cornered a young Apache woman against the canyon wall. She couldn't have been more than 20, with long black hair braided with turquoise beads and wearing traditional buckskin clothing that marked her as someone of importance in her tribe. Her dark eyes blazed with defiance even as one man held a knife to her throat. The men were clearly drifters, the kind of scavengers who followed cattle drives and mining camps looking for easy prey. Their clothes were filthy, their faces unshaven, and they carried themselves with the casual cruelty of men who'd learned that might made right on the frontier. Ezra had seen enough violence to recognize what was about to happen. These men weren't planning to ransom her or trade her back to her people. They were predators, and she was alone, outnumbered, and trapped. Every instinct told him to ride away. Apache and white settlers had been at war for decades. Getting involved would likely mean his death, and for what? To save someone whose people might kill him on sight. The smart choice was obvious. But as he watched the woman's face, seeing not fear but fury in her expression, something shifted inside him. Maybe it was remembering Sarah Hendricks, the rancher's daughter who'd been like a sister to him, found dead in the ruins of the house he'd failed to protect. Maybe it was the way this woman held herself, refusing to beg or break, even facing certain death. Or maybe it was simply that some lines couldn't be crossed without a man losing pieces of himself he'd never get back. Ezra checked his rifle, counted the rounds in his belt, and began working his way down toward the canyon floor. He moved carefully, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. The men below were focused on their captive, confident in their isolation and superior numbers. That confidence would be their mistake. The first shot took the man with the knife through the shoulder, spinning him away from the woman and sending his weapon clattering across the rocks. Ezra worked the Henry's lever, chambering another round even as the other two men spun toward the sound of gunfire. The woman didn't freeze. The moment her captor staggered back, she moved like lightning, snatching up a sharp piece of sandstone and slashing it across the wounded man's throat. Blood sprayed across the canyon wall as he collapsed, gurgling and clutching his neck. The remaining two men dove for cover, one behind a boulder, the other pressing himself against the canyon wall. They began returning fire with pistols, bullets sparking off rocks near Ezra's position. He shifted left, using a fallen log for protection, and squeezed off another shot that sent stone chips flying near the second man's head. That's when everything went wrong. The sharp whistle of arrows cutting through air reached Ezra's ears a split second before the first. One punched through his left shoulder. He gasped, nearly dropping the rifle as fire exploded through his arm. Two more arrows followed in rapid succession, one grazing his ribs and the third burying itself deep in his right thigh. Apache warriors materialized from hiding places that had been invisible moments before. They'd been watching, waiting, probably deciding whether to intervene or simply let the white men kill each other. Ezra's shots had forced their hand. He tried to bring his rifle around, but his left arm wouldn't respond properly. Blood was soaking through his shirt, and his leg felt like it was on fire. The two surviving drifters were shouting, confused by this new threat, their guns swinging between Ezra and the Apache warriors. The young woman called out in her own language, her voice sharp with authority. The warriors hesitated, their bows half drawn, arrows nocked but not yet released. She continued speaking rapidly, gesturing toward Ezra, then toward the two drifters who were now backing away along the canyon wall. Whatever she said seemed to carry weight. The warriors lowered their weapons slightly, though they kept them ready. She approached Ezra slowly, her dark eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she could see straight through to his intentions. Up close, she was even more striking than he'd realized. Her features were fine-boned but strong, with high cheekbones and a mouth that suggested both gentleness and determination. The turquoise beads in her hair caught the afternoon light, and there was intelligence in her gaze that spoke of education beyond what most frontier women, white or Apache, ever received. She knelt beside him, examining his wounds with practiced efficiency. Her hands were gentle but sure as she tested the arrow's placement, and when she looked up at him, there was something in her expression he couldn't quite interpret. She spoke then, in English that carried only the faintest trace of accent, her voice low and musical despite the circumstances. "You could have ridden past. Why did you not?" The question hung in the desert air between them, weighted with implications Ezra didn't fully understand. Around them, the Apache warriors waited, their eyes never leaving the two surviving drifters who were slowly edging toward their horses. Ezra tried to answer, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain about Sarah, about the ranch, about the hollow feeling that had been eating at him for months? How could he tell her that saving her had been less about heroism, and more about proving to himself that he was still capable of doing something right? Instead, he simply said, "Seemed like the thing to do." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if his simple answer had told her everything she needed to know. Rising to her feet, she spoke again to the warriors in Apache. This time, her words were clearly commands, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Two of the warriors moved toward the surviving drifters, who had reached their horses and were frantically trying to mount. The men got into their saddles but found their way blocked by Apache warriors, who seemed to have materialized from the canyon walls themselves. After a brief, heated exchange conducted mostly through gestures and broken English, the drifters were allowed to ride away, but not before being stripped of their weapons and most of their supplies. The woman returned to Ezra's side, this time accompanied by an older warrior whose weathered face bore the scars of many battles. He looked down at Ezra with obvious suspicion, speaking rapidly in Apache. The woman responded with what sounded like patient explanation, gesturing toward the dead man whose throat she'd cut. Finally, the older warrior grunted what might have been agreement. He barked orders to the other warriors, who began moving with purposeful efficiency. Two of them lifted Ezra carefully, ignoring his grunt of pain as the movement shifted the arrows in his shoulder and thigh. As they carried him toward the canyon mouth where horses waited, the woman walked beside them. She didn't speak again, but Ezra found himself acutely aware of her presence. There was something about her that went beyond mere beauty or even the obvious courage she displayed. She carried herself with a quiet authority that suggested leadership, and the way the warriors deferred to her spoke of position and respect within her tribe. They reached a hidden camp nestled in a box canyon about 2 miles from where the confrontation had taken place. It was larger than Ezra had expected, with perhaps 30 people including women, children, and elders. The dwellings were a mixture of traditional wickiups and canvas tents, arranged around a central fire pit where several women were preparing what smelled like rabbit stew. The arrival of the party caused a stir, with people emerging from their shelters to stare at the wounded white man being carried through their camp. Ezra caught fragments of rapid conversation in Apache, some voices clearly hostile, others curious. Children peered at him from behind their mothers' skirts, their dark eyes wide with fascination. He was taken to a large wickiup at the far end of the camp and laid carefully on a bed of buffalo robes. The shelter was surprisingly spacious inside, with personal belongings that suggested this was the woman's own dwelling. Painted hide shields hung from the framework, alongside items that seemed oddly out of place in an Apache camp. Books with English titles, a silverback mirror, a photograph in a wooden frame showing a young Apache woman in the dress of an Eastern finishing school. The woman who'd saved him entered carrying a leather bag filled with medical supplies. She knelt beside him again, this time beginning the painful process of removing his shirt to better examine his wounds. As she worked, she spoke quietly, perhaps to distract him from the pain. "My name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom in your language. What are you called?" "Ezra," he managed through gritted teeth as she probed the arrow wound in his shoulder. "Ezra Whitman." "Ezra," she repeated, as if testing how his name felt in her mouth. "You ride alone. No family, no other cowboys with you. That is dangerous in this country." He started to explain about the stolen cattle, about tracking the rustlers, but she held up a hand to stop him. Her attention was focused entirely on the arrow in his thigh now, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This one went deep," she said, more to herself than to him. "The point is lodged against the bone. Removing it will be ... difficult." She reached into her bag and withdrew a bottle of what looked like whiskey, along with several strips of clean cloth and a curved knife with an obsidian blade. The implications were clear, and Ezra felt his mouth go dry with more than just blood loss. "Have you done this before?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ayana looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw something that might have been amusement in her dark eyes. "I studied medicine at a school in Santa Fe for 2 years, she said, "before my father decided such education was making me too much like a white woman and called me home. I have removed many arrows, Ezra Whitman. You will live." She said it with such quiet confidence that he found himself believing her, despite the pain that was making his vision blur around the edges. As she began to work, using the whiskey first to sterilize her blade and then offering him the bottle, He wondered what kind of woman this was who could switch so seamlessly from deadly fighter to skilled healer. The next hour passed in a haze of alcohol and agony as Ayanna carefully extracted the arrow points from his shoulder and thigh. She worked with steady hands and obvious expertise, talking him through the worst moments with a calm voice that anchored him when the pain threatened to drag him under. When it was finally over, his wounds cleaned and bandaged with herb-soaked cloth that smelled of sage and something else he couldn't identify, Ezra lay back against the buffalo robes feeling like he'd been trampled by a Mustang. But he was alive, and the bleeding had stopped. Ayanna sat back on her heels, wiping blood from her hands with a clean cloth. She studied her work with professional satisfaction, then looked at his face. "You need rest," she said. "And food, when your stomach can hold it? The wounds are clean, but infection is always a danger. You will stay here while you heal." It wasn't really a question, but Ezra nodded anyway. Even if he'd wanted to leave, which he didn't, he couldn't have made it 50 yards in his current condition. Besides, he was curious about this woman who spoke with such authority, who carried herself like a leader despite her youth. "Your people," he said, his voice hoarse from the pain and whiskey. "They don't seem entirely happy about having me here." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke again, her voice carried weight that suggested painful experience. "My people have learned to be suspicious of white men," she said simply. "We have been betrayed before. Promised safety and given bullets. Promised food and given poison. Promised land and given nothing but broken words." She stood and moved to the entrance of the wickiup, looking out at the camp where evening fires were beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. Her silhouette against the fading light was graceful and strong, and Ezra found himself studying the proud set of her shoulders, the way she held her head like a queen surveying her domain. "But you saved my life," she continued, still looking outward. "And in doing so, you nearly lost your own. That means something to my people. It means something to me." She turned back toward him then, and in the flickering light from the fire pit outside, her face was beautiful and mysterious and somehow sad. "Sleep now, Ezra Whitman," she said. "Tomorrow we will see what tomorrow brings." As she moved to leave the wickiup, Ezra called out softly, "Ayanna." She paused, looking back at him. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded once, then slipped out into the night, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the camp settling into evening routine. Quiet conversations around cook fires, children being called in from play, horses being secured for the night. It should have felt alien, threatening even. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful, as if he'd stumbled into a pocket of the world where time moved differently and old rules didn't apply. As sleep began to claim him, dulled by pain and whiskey and exhaustion, Ezra's last conscious thought was of Ayanna's face in the firelight and the way she'd looked at him when she'd asked why he hadn't ridden past. There had been something in that look, something that suggested his answer had been more important than he'd realized, something that suggested tomorrow would indeed bring things he couldn't yet imagine. The sounds of the camp faded into the darkness, and Ezra Whitman slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man whose world had shifted on its axis without him even knowing it. Dawn came slowly to the high desert, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the very stones on fire. Ezra woke to the sound of voices speaking quietly in Apache outside the wickiup, accompanied by the soft crackle of a cooking fire and the familiar sounds of a camp stirring to life. The pain hit him immediately as consciousness returned, sharp reminders in his shoulder and thigh of the previous day's events. But the agony that had consumed him during the night had settled into something more manageable, a constant ache that spoke of healing rather than dying. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as fire shot through his wounded shoulder. A soft sound at the entrance made him look up to see Ayanna ducking through the opening, carrying a wooden bowl that steamed in the cool morning air. "You should not try to move yet," she said, settling gracefully beside him on the buffalo robes. The wounds need time to begin healing properly. She was dressed differently this morning, in a simple buckskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the early light, filtering through the Wikiup's entrance. Her long black hair was unbraided, flowing loose over her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable than she had during yesterday's crisis. "I brought you broth," she continued, holding up the bowl. "Rabbit and wild onions with herbs that will help fight infection. Can you sit up enough to drink?" With her help, Ezra managed to prop himself against the Wikiup's framework without putting too much strain on his wounds. The broth was rich and flavorful, warming him from the inside out. As he drank, he became aware of Ayanna watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes, as if she was trying to solve some puzzle he represented. "You have questions," he said after draining half the bowl. It wasn't really a question. She nodded slowly. "Many questions. But first, tell me about these men you were tracking. The cattle thieves. This is why you were in Apache country alone?" Ezra set down the bowl, surprised by how much effort even that simple action required. The blood loss had left him weaker than he'd realized. "They killed a family," he said simply. "Good people who took me in when I had nothing. Burned their ranch, murdered them in their sleep, then stole their cattle to cover their tracks. I've been following them for 3 weeks." Ayanna's expression grew thoughtful. "And you think these men who attacked me yesterday, they were part of this group?" "Maybe. Probably. The kind of men who'd murder a family for their livestock aren't likely to draw lines about other crimes." She was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but carried an edge of steel. "The Hendricks family, near Socorro. A man, his wife, and their daughter." Ezra's head snapped up, ignoring the spike of pain the sudden movement caused. "You know about them?" "Word travels quickly in this country, especially news of violence. We heard about the killings from traders who came through our territory 2 weeks ago." Her eyes met his. "You were like family to them," the traders said. "You worked their ranch for many years." The simple statement hit him harder than he'd expected. Family. Yes, that's what the Hendricks had been to him. The closest thing to a real home he'd known since his parents died. And he'd failed them just as completely as he'd failed everyone else who'd ever mattered to him. "I should have been there," he said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "If I hadn't been in town drinking away my sorrows, maybe I could have stopped it." Ayanna studied his face with an expression that seemed to see straight through his careful defenses. "Or maybe you would simply be dead alongside them," she said quietly. "Sometimes survival is not a choice we make, but a gift we are given. The question is what we do with that gift." Her words carried the weight of personal experience, and Ezra found himself wondering what losses she'd endured, what sorrows had shaped the wisdom he heard in her voice. "What about you?" he asked. "Yesterday, when those men had you cornered, you didn't seem afraid. Most people would have been terrified." A shadow crossed her face, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Fear is a luxury my people cannot afford," she said. "We have learned that showing weakness invites predators, whether they wear army uniforms or the clothes of common criminals." She rose and moved to the Wikiup's entrance, looking out at the morning activity in the camp. Several children were playing a game that involved throwing small rocks at targets drawn in the dirt, their laughter bright in the desert air. Women were preparing food over cook fires while men checked weapons and tended to horses. "My father leads this band," Ayanna continued without turning around. "We are what the Army calls renegades, Apache who refuse to accept reservation life. We move constantly, staying ahead of the soldiers, taking what we need to survive. And you? What do you want?" She was quiet for so long that Ezra thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want my people to be free, to live as we have always lived, following the seasons and the game, raising our children to know the old ways." She turned back toward him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But I also know that world is ending. The white settlers come in greater numbers each year. The army builds more forts. The buffalo disappear, and with them, our way of life. So what will you do? Survive, she said simply. Find a way for my people to survive with dignity, even if it means changing everything we are. The conversation was interrupted by voices outside the wickiup, speaking rapidly in Apache. Ayanna listened for a moment, then her expression grew tense. My father wants to speak with you, she said. When you are strong enough? I'm strong enough now, she shook her head. No, you are not. But he is ... impatient. And there are others in the band who question why we keep a white man alive in our camp, wounded or not. Ezra could hear the tension in her voice, could sense the delicate political situation his presence had created. He started to push himself up from the robes, ignoring the pain that flared through his wounds. Then maybe we shouldn't keep them waiting. Ezra, no. You have lost too much blood. Moving too soon could reopen the wounds. But he was already struggling to his feet, using the wickiup's framework for support. The world spun around him for a moment, gray spots dancing at the edges of his vision, but he managed to stay upright. I've had worse, he lied, though in truth he felt like he might collapse at any moment. And if your father has questions, better to answer them while I still can. Ayanna looked like she wanted to argue further, but the voices outside were growing more insistent. With obvious reluctance, she moved to his side, offering her shoulder for support. Lean on me, she said, and if you faint, I will leave you where you fall. Despite everything, Ezra found himself almost smiling at the threat. There was something about this woman's combination of compassion and steel that he found oddly comforting. They made their way slowly out of the wickiup and into the bright morning sunlight. The camp fell silent as they emerged, dozens of dark eyes tracking their progress across the central clearing toward a large wickiup at the far end. Ezra was acutely aware of being the only white face in a sea of people who had every reason to view him as an enemy. The man who emerged from the large wickiup was clearly Ayanna's father. He had the same intelligent dark eyes, the same proud bearing, though his face was weathered by decades of hard living and his long hair was streaked with silver. He wore traditional Apache clothing but with touches that spoke of contact with the white world. A silver bracelet, boots instead of moccasins, a gun belt with a modern revolver. Several other men flanked him, warriors whose scarred faces and hard eyes spoke of many battles. They watched Ezra with undisguised suspicion as he and Ayanna approached. The chief spoke first, in English that was fluent but heavily accented. I am Nalnish, war leader of this band. My daughter tells me you saved her life yesterday. Yes, sir. She also tells me you took 3 arrows meant for Apache warriors. This is ... unexpected for a white man. Ezra could feel the weight of expectation in the silence that followed. Whatever he said next would determine not just his own fate, but possibly Ayanna's as well. He chose his words carefully. Your daughter was in danger. The men who threatened her were the kind who prey on anyone they think is helpless. I couldn't stand by and watch that happen. One of the warriors spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone clearly hostile. Nalnish listened, then raised a hand for silence. Clizin believes you are a spy, sent to learn about our movement so you can lead soldiers to us. He thinks we should kill you now and be done with it. Ezra met the chief's gaze steadily, despite the weakness that was making his legs tremble. If I were a spy, would I have revealed myself to save one person? Wouldn't I have stayed hidden and followed you back to this camp? Perhaps. Or perhaps you are simply a clever spy who knows that saving my daughter would earn you trust and access to our secrets. The logic was sound, and Ezra couldn't fault them for their suspicion. In their place, he would probably think the same thing. I'm not a spy, he said simply. I'm a man who lost his family to murderers and has been tracking them across half of New Mexico territory. Yesterday I saw someone in danger and acted without thinking about the consequences. That's all. Nalnish studied him for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing. Finally, he spoke again. "My daughter believes you. She says you could have ridden past but chose to risk your life instead. This speaks to your character, but it does not answer all questions." He gestured toward one of the other warriors who stepped forward carrying Ezra's rifle and gun belt. "These are good weapons, well maintained. The rifle especially is worth more than most cowboys see in a year. Where does a simple ranch hand get such things?" Ezra recognized the test in the question. These men weren't fools, and they'd obviously examined his gear carefully. "The rifle was my father's," he said. "He was a cavalry officer before he retired to ranch in Texas. The Colt I bought with my first year's wages at the Hendricks place. A man needs good tools to do his job properly." "And what job is that, exactly? You say you worked for this family, but you ride alone, track killers across dangerous country. This is not the behavior of a simple cowboy." Ayanna's hand tightened slightly on his arm, a warning he could feel even through his shirt sleeve. He was walking a narrow line here, and one wrong word could get them both killed. "Before I worked for the Hendricks family, I was other things," Ezra said carefully. "I've been a town marshal, a cavalry scout, a bounty hunter. Men who've lived hard lives tend to find each other, and the Hendricks gave me a chance to settle down, to be part of something good. When they were murdered, I couldn't let that go unanswered." The explanation seemed to satisfy something in Nalnish's expression. He nodded slowly, then spoke to his men in rapid Apache. There was some back and forth, clearly a debate about what to do with their unwilling guest. Finally, the chief turned back to Ezra. "You will stay in our camp until your wounds heal. This is not a request. When you are strong enough to travel, we will discuss what happens next. Until then, you are under my daughter's protection. Any who would harm you will answer to me." It was clearly a dismissal, and Ezra felt relief flood through him as the tension broke. But as Ayanna helped him back toward her wickiup, he caught fragments of continued conversation between the warriors. He didn't speak Apache, but he'd learned to read tones and body language during his years on the frontier. Not everyone was happy with their chief's decision. "Your father seems like a reasonable man," he said as they settled back into the relative privacy of the wickiup. "My father is a survivor," Ayanna replied, helping him ease back down onto the buffalo robes. "He knows that sometimes the most dangerous course is also the most honorable one. But there are others in the band who believe any white man is an enemy, regardless of his actions." "And what do you believe?" She was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes studying his face with that intense focus that seemed to see straight through him. "I believe that yesterday you proved you are not like other white men I have known," she said finally. "But I also believe that trust must be earned over time, not just through one act of courage." "Fair enough." As the day wore on, Ezra found himself drifting in and out of sleep, his body demanding rest to heal the trauma it had endured. But even when he slept, he was aware of Ayanna's presence nearby, sometimes tending to his wounds, sometimes working on what looked like beadwork, sometimes simply sitting quietly and watching the activity outside. When he woke fully as afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen, she was grinding something with a stone mortar and pestle, filling the wickiup with the sharp, clean scent of crushed herbs. "Medicine?" he asked. "For your wounds," she confirmed. "And something to help you sleep tonight without pain." She mixed the ground herbs with water from a gourd, creating a paste that she applied to his bandages with gentle, practiced movements. Her touch was soft but sure, and Ezra found himself acutely aware of her nearness, of the way afternoon light caught the blue-black highlights in her hair. "Can I ask you something?" he said as she worked. "You may ask. I may choose not to answer. Yesterday, when your father's warriors could have killed those other two men but didn't, that was because of something you said to them. What did you tell them?" Ayanna's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their careful ministrations. "I told them that you had proved yourself worthy of Apache honor by risking your life for someone who is not your kin, not your people. I said that killing the other men after they had been defeated and disarmed would diminish that honor. And they listened to you. They listened because my father taught me to speak with wisdom and because I have proven myself in other ways." She looked up at him then, and there was something in her expression that spoke of pride and pain mixed together. "I am not just Nalnish's daughter. I am what your people would call a war chief in my own right. I have led raids, fought soldiers, made decisions that meant life or death for my people." The revelation shouldn't have surprised him, given everything he'd observed about her, but it added another layer to his understanding of this remarkable woman. "That's why you carry yourself like a leader," he said. "Why the warriors defer to you. Leadership among my people is earned through deed, not birth," she said simply. "Man or woman, what matters is wisdom, courage, and the ability to put the good of the people above your own desires. And what do your desires tell you about me?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Ayanna finished applying the herbal paste and began rewrapping his wounds with clean cloth, her movements careful and professional. "My desires are not important," she said finally. "What matters is whether you can be trusted, whether your presence here helps or harms my people. And what's your judgment on that?" She tied off the last bandage and sat back on her heels, studying him with those dark, penetrating eyes. "I think you are a man who has lost much and is trying to find his way back to something worth living for," she said quietly. "I think you are dangerous, not because you mean harm, but because you represent choices my people are not ready to make." "What kind of choices?" "The choice between the old ways and the new, between war and peace, between isolation and—" She trailed off as if she'd said more than she intended. "And what?" But before she could answer, shouts erupted from outside the wickiup, urgent voices calling out in Apache. Ayanna was on her feet instantly, moving to the entrance to look out at the camp. What she saw there made her face go pale. "What is it?" Ezra asked, struggling to sit up despite the pain. "Riders," she said, her voice tight with tension, "coming fast from the south. Many horses." The implications hit him immediately. In Apache country, riders approaching fast usually meant only one thing: soldiers. And if the army had tracked this band to their hidden canyon, the peaceful morning was about to become a fight for survival. The dust cloud on the southern horizon grew larger by the minute, and with it, the tension in the Apache camp reached a breaking point. Warriors emerged from wickiups carrying rifles and war lances, women began gathering children and essential supplies, and the elderly started moving toward predetermined escape routes deeper into the canyon system. Ezra watched the organized chaos from the entrance of Ayanna's wickiup, frustrated by his own helplessness. Even if he could stand without support, which was questionable, he would be more liability than asset in whatever was coming. "How many?" he asked as Ayanna returned from speaking with the scouts who'd brought the warning. 15, maybe 20 riders, she said, her voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "They wear no uniforms, but they ride in formation like soldiers. And they are pushing their horses hard, as if they know exactly where they are going." The implications were clear. This wasn't a random patrol that had stumbled across their trail. Someone had told these men where to find the hidden camp. Chief Nalnish appeared at the wickiup entrance, his weathered face grim with determination. He spoke rapidly to his daughter in Apache, then switched to English for Ezra's benefit. "We have perhaps 30 minutes before they reach the canyon mouth," he said. "Most of our people will retreat to the high caves, but I am leaving warriors behind to delay them. This will give the others time to escape." "Father, no," Ayanna said, her composure finally cracking. "If these men know about this place, they know about the caves too. It could be a trap to drive us into a dead end, perhaps. But we cannot outrun horses while carrying the children and elders. Some must stay and fight." Ezra struggled to his feet, ignoring the fire that shot through his wounds. "Give me a rifle. I can shoot from cover as well as anyone." Both Apache turned to stare at him as if he'd lost his mind. You can barely stand, Ayanna said. And why would you fight for people you do not know, against men who might be your own kind? It was a fair question, and one Ezra had been asking himself since the moment he decided to intervene yesterday. But as he looked at the organized evacuation around them, at children being hurried to safety and warriors preparing to die protecting them, the answer became crystal clear. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. And because those men out there, whoever they are, they're not my kind. My kind doesn't hunt down families and corner women in canyons. Nalnish studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Plizen was wrong about you, he said. You are not a spy. You are something more dangerous than that. What's that supposed to mean? You are a bridge, the chief replied, between two worlds that have been at war for generations. And bridges are the most dangerous things of all because they make men question everything they believed about their enemies. Before Ezra could respond to that cryptic statement, one of the scouts came running back into camp, shouting urgent words in Apache. Nalnish's expression darkened as he listened. What is it? Ayanna asked. The riders have split into two groups, her father said grimly. One is coming through the main canyon, but the other is circling around to block the escape routes. They do know about the caves. The trap was springing shut around them, and suddenly the organized evacuation looked less like a strategic withdrawal and more like sheep being herded towards slaughter. There has to be another way out, Ezra said, his mind racing despite the fog of pain and medication. This canyon, it must connect to others. There's always another way if you know where to look. Yes, Ayanna said slowly, understanding dawning in her dark eyes. The sacred cave system behind the waterfall. But it is forbidden to outsiders, and the path is treacherous even for those who know it. Forbiddance is better than dead, Ezra pointed out. Nalnish looked torn between tradition and necessity, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. Around them, the sounds of preparation were reaching a crescendo as the last of the non-combatants gathered their belongings. If we take that path and are discovered, it will be seen as desecration by the other bands, he said. It could turn every Apache against us. And if you don't take it, there might not be any bands left to be angry with you. The logic was brutal but undeniable. After another moment of internal struggle, the chief made his decision. Ayanna, take 12 of our best people and guide them through the sacred caves. I will lead the rest in a fighting retreat through the main canyon, try to draw the attackers away. Father, I should stay and fight beside you. No, your people will need you on the other side, and someone must preserve our history if this ends badly. His eyes moved to Ezra. Take the white man with you. If he speaks truth about wanting to help, let him prove it by protecting our most vulnerable. It was a test, Ezra realized, not just of his intentions, but of his character. Could he be trusted with the lives of Apache children and elders? Could he guide them to safety even at the cost of his own life? I'll need a horse, he said, and a rifle. I may not be much use in a stand-up fight, but I can still shoot straight. Nalnish nodded and barked orders in Apache. Within minutes, Ezra found himself mounted on a sturdy pinto mare. His weapons returned to him along with extra ammunition. The pain in his shoulder and thigh was manageable as long as he didn't make any sudden movements, and the horse was steady and responsive. Ayanna had changed into trail clothing and war paint, transforming from healer to warrior before his eyes. She carried a repeating rifle with practiced ease and had a curved knife at her belt that looked like it had tasted blood before. Their group consisted of 8 elders, 6 children ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 15, and 4 warriors to act as guards. It was a precious cargo of Apache knowledge and future, and the responsibility felt heavier than any badge Ezra had ever worn. The sacred waterfall was hidden behind a fold in the canyon wall, accessible only by a narrow ledge that required dismounting and leading the horses single file. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached, and Ezra could see why this place might be considered holy. The fall dropped perhaps 60 feet into a crystalline pool, surrounded by ancient petroglyphs carved into the red stone walls. "The entrance is behind the water," Ayana explained as they reached the pool. "There is a ledge, but it is narrow and slippery. The children will need help." She demonstrated by wading into the pool until the water reached her waist, then disappearing behind the curtain of falling water. A moment later, her voice echoed from the hidden space beyond. "It is safe. Send the first group." What followed was a tense, dangerous process of moving elderly Apache and young children across wet stone ledges in near total darkness. The horses had to be left behind, their presence marked only by hobbles and hope that they would still be there when this ordeal ended. Ezra found himself carrying a 5-year-old girl whose grandmother was too frail to manage the crossing alone. The child clung to him with complete trust, her dark eyes wide with fear but no tears. Apache children, he was learning, were taught courage from an early age. The cave system beyond the waterfall was vast and labyrinthine, with passages branching off in multiple directions. Ancient paintings decorated the walls, depicting hunts and ceremonies from generations past. It was indeed sacred space, and Ezra felt the weight of that sanctity as they moved deeper into the mountain's heart. Ayana led them with sure steps, following passages that seemed identical to Ezra but were apparently well known to her. Behind them, the sound of gunfire began echoing through the canyons, sharp cracks that spoke of the battle they'd left behind. "How far to the other side?" Ezra asked during a brief rest stop. 3 hours, if we make good time," Ayana replied. "But some of our group cannot move quickly, and there are places where the path is dangerous even for the sure-footed." As if to emphasize her point, one of the elderly men stumbled and would have fallen if not for Ezra's quick grab. The old warrior nodded his thanks but said nothing, his pride evident even in extremity. They pressed on, deeper into the mountain's belly, guided only by Ayana's knowledge and the occasional shaft of light from hidden openings high above. The air grew thinner and cooler as they climbed, and Ezra's wounds began to throb with renewed intensity. Halfway through their underground journey, disaster struck. A section of the path had been weakened by recent rains, and when one of the younger warriors stepped on it, the stone gave way beneath his feet. He fell perhaps 15 feet into a side chamber, his cry of pain echoing through the caverns. "Broken leg," Ayana said after examining him by the light of a torch. "Maybe ribs as well. He cannot continue." The warrior, a man called Taze, tried to argue, but it was clear he could barely sit upright, let alone walk. Leaving him behind was unthinkable, but carrying him would slow their progress to a crawl and might get everyone killed. "I'll stay with him," Ezra said quietly. "Get the others to safety, then come back for us if you can." Ayana stared at him as if he'd suggested flying to the moon. "That is not your burden to carry." "Maybe not. But I'm the most expendable person in this group, and Taze needs medical attention I can't provide, but you can." "It makes sense. The men pursuing us, if they find the cave entrance, they will eventually find you. Then I guess I'd better hope they don't find the entrance." It was a plan born of necessity rather than wisdom, but sometimes those were the only kind that worked. After a heated discussion in Apache between Ayana and the other warriors, the decision was made. Ezra would remain with Taze in the side chamber while the rest continued to the far exit. As the group prepared to leave, Ayana knelt beside Ezra in the torchlight. Her face was painted for war, but her eyes held an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why do you keep risking yourself for people you barely know?" It was the same question she'd asked in the canyon, but this time Ezra thought he had a better answer. "Maybe because I've spent so many years failing the people I cared about," he said. "Maybe this is my chance to get it right for once." She studied his face for a long moment, then reached up and touched his cheek with fingers that were surprisingly gentle despite their calluses. "If we do not return," she said, "know that you have earned the respect of my people. That is not a gift we give lightly." Before he could respond, she was gone, leading the others deeper into the mountain's darkness. The sound of their passage faded quickly, leaving Ezra alone with an injured warrior and the growing certainty that he might never see daylight again. Taizé drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and labored. Ezra did what he could to make him comfortable, sharing water from his canteen and trying to splint the broken leg with torn pieces of cloth and straight pieces of cave stone. Hours passed in darkness, broken only by the stub of their single torch. When voices began echoing through the caverns, speaking English with harsh accents, Ezra knew their hunters had found the sacred cave. "Can you shoot?" he whispered to Taizé during a moment of lucidity. The warrior nodded weakly and accepted Ezra's backup pistol, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson that had seen better days but still functioned reliably. "How many bullets?" Taizé asked. "6 in the gun, maybe a dozen more in my belt. You?" "4. 10 shots between them, against however many men were working their way through the cave system." Not good odds, but Ezra had faced worse and lived to tell about it. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the yellow glow of multiple torches. These men were being methodical, checking every passage and chamber as they advanced. It was only a matter of time before they found the side chamber where Ezra and Taizé waited. When the first torchlight appeared at the chamber entrance, Ezra was ready. He put 2 shots into the torchbearer before the man could raise his weapon, the muzzle flashes illuminating the cavern in stark detail. Shouts erupted from the main passage as the other hunters realized they'd found their quarry. What followed was a running gun battle in near-total darkness, with Ezra using his knowledge of the chamber's layout to stay one step ahead of men who had numbers but lacked familiarity with the terrain. He moved constantly, never firing from the same position twice, making each shot count. But ammunition was limited, and eventually the law of numbers began to tell. A bullet grazed his already wounded shoulder, sending fire through his arm. Another sparked off stone near his head, filling his eyes with rock dust. When his rifle clicked empty, Ezra drew his Colt and continued fighting. Beside him, Taizé contributed what he could, his shots careful and accurate despite his injuries. "How many left?" the Apache warrior asked during a brief lull. "Too many," Ezra replied honestly. He had perhaps 3 rounds remaining and could hear at least 5 distinct voices in the main passage. That's when the sound of new gunfire erupted from deeper in the cave system, coming from the direction Ayana's group had taken. Either they'd run into more trouble, or Ayana, Taizé said, understanding immediately. She'd come back for them, despite the risk to herself and the others. The thought filled Ezra with a mixture of gratitude and terror. If something happened to her because of his decision to stay behind, he'd never forgive himself. The new gunfire was closer now, and the men who'd been hunting Ezra suddenly found themselves caught between 2 forces. Shouts of confusion echoed through the caverns as they tried to reposition to meet this unexpected threat. In the chaos, Ezra saw his chance. He burst from cover, firing his last 3 rounds at muzzle flashes in the darkness. One shot found its mark, eliciting a scream of pain. The others went wide, but they served their purpose of creating confusion and drawing attention. Something slammed into his chest, driving him backward against the cave wall. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs and sent his empty pistol clattering across stone. He tried to raise himself but found that his strength was finally giving out, blood loss and exhaustion taking their toll. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear the gunfire moving away toward the cave entrance. Ayana's voice called out in Apache, sharp commands that were answered by other voices. The rescue had turned into a counterattack, driving their pursuers back through the sacred caverns. Ezra tried to call out, to let them know where he and Taizé were, but only a weak croak emerged from his throat. Darkness was closing in around the edges of his vision, and he had the distant thought that he might finally be joining the Hendricks family after all. But then torchlight was flooding the chamber, and Ayana was kneeling beside him, her hands moving over his chest with practiced efficiency. "The bullet passed through," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Missed anything vital, but you have lost too much blood." "Taze?" he managed to whisper. "Alive, hurt, but alive." She looked down at him, and in the flickering torchlight, her face was beautiful and terrible and somehow sad. "Why do you keep doing this? Why do you keep risking everything for people you barely know?" This time, Ezra thought he finally had the right answer. "Because maybe that's what makes someone worth knowing," he said. "What we're willing to risk for others." Something shifted in her expression then, something that spoke of walls coming down and decisions being made. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When you are healed," she said, "when this is over and you are strong again, I want you to stay." "Stay? With me, with my people. I want you to be my husband." The words hit him harder than the bullet had, stealing what little breath he had remaining. Through the fog of pain and blood loss, he tried to process what she was saying. "Hannah, I." "Do not answer now," she said quickly. "Think about it while you heal. Think about whether you could love a woman whose people are at war with yours. Think about whether you could find happiness in a life that might mean running forever, hiding, fighting for survival." Before he could respond, she was calling for help in Apache, organizing the evacuation from the caves. Strong hands lifted him carefully, and he found himself being carried through passages that seemed to blur together in a haze of torchlight and shadow. They emerged from the mountain into afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after hours in darkness. The exit was hidden in a fold of rock miles from the original camp, overlooking a valley where horses waited and the rest of their group had already established a temporary shelter. As Ezra was laid on blankets beside a small fire, he could see the smoke rising from the direction of their original camp. The battle was over, but at what cost he couldn't tell. Ayanna worked over his wounds with the same calm efficiency she'd shown before, cleaning and bandaging while she spoke quietly to the other survivors. From the fragments of conversation he could understand, it seemed they'd lost several warriors, but most of the band had escaped. "Your father?" he asked when she paused in her ministrations. "Alive, leading the others to our winter camp in the high country. We will meet them there when you are strong enough to travel. And the men who attacked you?" Her expression hardened. "Some escaped, others did not. But they learned that Apache are not easy prey, even when caught by surprise." As night fell over the temporary camp, Ezra lay staring up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the thin mountain air. Around him, the sounds of the small group settling into evening routine were both foreign and strangely comforting. Ayanna's proposal echoed in his thoughts, a door to a future he'd never imagined possible. Marriage to an Apache woman would mean leaving behind everything he'd known, embracing a life of constant danger and uncertainty. But it would also mean belonging somewhere again, being part of something larger than his own grief and vengeance. Could he do it? Could he find peace among people who had every reason to distrust him? Could he love a woman whose world was so different from his own? As if summoned by his thoughts, Ayanna appeared beside him in the firelight, carrying a bowl of the same healing broth she'd given him that first morning. "Drink," she said simply. "You need to regain your strength." As he sipped the warm liquid, she settled beside him on the blankets, her presence both comforting and electric. "The men who attacked your camp," Ezra said quietly. "Some of them might have been the same ones who killed the Hendricks family. Perhaps. Does it matter now? I don't know. Part of me thinks it should. I've been carrying that anger for so long, making it the center of everything I do." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Anger can keep a man alive when nothing else will," she said finally. "But it can also poison everything it touches, including the man who carries it. So what do I do with it? That is for you to decide. But I will tell you this. The Ezra Whitman who saved my life in that canyon, who stayed behind to protect an injured warrior, who fought beside Apache against his own kind, that man is not defined by his anger. He is defined by his choices. The words hung in the night air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new decisions to be made. But tonight, under the vast western sky, Ezra Whitman began to glimpse a future that looked nothing like his past. And for the first time in months, that didn't terrify him. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, its voice echoing across the desert landscape like a song of freedom. Ezra closed his eyes and listened, feeling something inside him begin to heal that had nothing to do with arrow wounds or bullet holes. Maybe some kinds of belonging were worth any price. Maybe some kinds of love were worth any risk. Maybe it was time to stop running from the future and start running toward it instead. As sleep finally claimed him, Ezra's last conscious thought was of Ayanna's face in the firelight and the way her eyes had looked when she'd asked him to stay. Tomorrow he would give her his answer, but deep in his heart he already knew what that answer would be.